We on? Hi, my name is Mike Lucas. I'm the Curator of Historical Archaeology at the New York State Museum. And today I'm standing in the Charles Fisher Gallery. It was named after our first curator of historical archaeology, and this gallery is dedicated to telling the story of, or some of the stories of Albany's past through the archaeology that was found beneath the streets, and it's called Beneath the City. As I said, some of these stories are told in this exhibit, but not all of the stories. One of the big things that is left out of this exhibition are the lives of enslaved people who lived in Albany during the 19th and early, or during the 18th and early 19th centuries. So what we're doing now is we're looking back over these old collections from Albany and trying to piece together those stories from the evidence that we have. There's over 500,000 artifacts that have been excavated in Albany and are currently in our collections, and what you see in this exhibition is only a sliver of the artifacts that we actually have. So during the late 18th century, it was a very tumultuous time in Albany. There were about 500 enslaved people who lived in Albany. About 1 in every 4 households held an enslaved person. And it was also a time when there was a great debate about emancipation. So the state legislature was debating this throughout the 1790s. 1799, they passed the Gradual Emancipation Act. That act basically said if you were enslaved before July 4th, 1799, you were enslaved for life. If you were born after July 4th, 1799, then you were enslaved for 25 years if you were a woman or 28 years if you were a man. Eventually, they passed a law in 1817 that freed everyone in 1827. So we want to try to be able to tell that story, the story of the struggle for freedom, and the story of these people's lives through the archaeology. Now, one of the things you'll see, this exhibit case here has artifacts from Stuart Dean's privy, from his household. Stuart Dean was a very famous individual in Albany. He was the second person from the United States to go to China on a commercial expedition, and these are artifacts from his household. So, but he was also an enslaver. So you could tell the story of Stuart Dean through artifacts like there's a cricket cage, there's fine china, and so on. But these aren't just Stuart Dean's artifacts. These are the objects from the household that also included enslaved people. So we want to try to look at assemblages and try to re-articulate the stories of these places that were found through archaeology. So one I want to talk about today is one particular excavation. It's where the current Department of Environmental Conservation office is, and before that office building was built, they did excavations. The ground was cleared, and they found all kinds of buildings from different time periods, foundations of buildings, and other types of features and artifacts and so on. So I want to talk about that project. So I'm going to walk over here where the artifacts are. And in this excavation, there were about 50,000 artifacts. So I want to talk a little bit first about the excavation itself, and one house in particular. There was a house that burned in 1797. It was owned by John Bogart at the time. It was previously occupied by Philip Lansing. Both Philip Lansing and John Bogart were enslavers. Philip Lansing had 5 enslaved people living in the house, and John Bogart, there were at least 2 enslaved people living there during the late 18th century. This is a picture of the excavation, if you can see that. if you can see, it might be hard to see on here, but there's some dark area right here. That's the burned floor. So we know the house burned down in 1797. What's nice is when a house burns down and you know the date, everything below that burned layer, we know it was placed there before 1797. So we've got this burned floor area, an interior wall, and then there was a barrel right next to that wall. So I'm going to be talking about the contents of that barrel. Now, the reason why we're interested in this particular site is because, it's not just the burned floor of the building, it's actually the burned floor of the basement. So we know, and in New York in particular, enslaved people often lived or worked or both in the cellars and in the basements of buildings. And you can see this is a passage from Sojourner Truth's narrative that talks about the conditions in the cellar and people sleeping basically in the mud and on floorboards with nothing more than some straw and a blanket. So if you think about it, this is a place where enslaved people were living, so we might be able to find some of the material culture that those people were using, their possessions, tools, and so on. So for the Bogart house, when the house was burned, it was owned by the Bogarts. So we don't have any of the names of the enslaved people at the Lansing house, but we do have 2 names so far from the Bogarts household. And one of them is a man named Will. You can see this is and the reason we know that he lived there, this is a runaway advertisement. So Will ran away he ran away at least to Troy, we know, because he ran away with his wife, whose name was Bet, and his son's name was Charles, and his daughter's name was Jane. So they ran away as a family and escaped. Bill escaped the Bogart household, and Bet and the children were in another household in Troy. They may have gone to Massachusetts. We don't know what happened to them. We don't know if they were successful in their escape, if they were recaptured. We're not for sure. That's what we have, very little information at this point. But we do have, there's another advertisement in the newspaper, a notice from John Bogart that from 1803 saying that he wants to sell a man and a woman that are living at his house. So this could be Bet and Will. We're not sure. This is the type of, so if you're looking for historical information, this is the type of scant historical information that you have about enslaved people. Here's another one, and we only know this person because we have another runaway ad. This is a man named Jack who ran away from the John Bogart household in 1803. Both of these individuals, John Bogart, by the way, was a skipper. He was a captain of a sloop on the Hudson. So both Jack and Will would have worked on this sloop with John Bogart. So it says Jack ran away when he was 23 years old, and he was trying to make his way to Canada. So what we're trying to do then is understand, at least in the case of Will, we know that he was living here at the time of the fire. So underneath the floorboards of this house, like I said, there was a barrel. It was about this big around and about that tall, and it was filled with artifacts. Most of the artifacts were on the bottom because it looks like the barrel was being used when the house burned down. We know it's not like a sump, a drain, or something like that. So the best estimate, it was probably a storage place where things were stored. So there's a good chance it was stored by enslaved people who were living on the site. So some of the artifacts, if you look at, and I've just got a selection of artifacts here. There's more artifacts that we have upstairs. But we have things like a whole brick. Now, this is a type of thing you're going to find in a trash pit of any sort, but to find just one whole brick without any other brick pieces is kind of unusual. I'm not sure what to make of that. It's open for discussion. We also have things that, food remains that you would find, like oyster shells, there's animal bones, things you'd find in a trash pit, essentially. There's also ceramics. Here's a nice Chinese porcelain tea bowl. There's also salt glazed plate, a redware porringer, and a plate here that's a tin glazed plate. So the interesting thing here is most of the ceramics are blue and white. So they may just be rubbish, but they may have been kept because of their color, and we're not sure on that. But they look pretty much like any refuse you'd find in a say a well or a privy or something like that. This is another type of thing that you'll find is bottle glass. This is a bottle base of and the finish would have been like this. This is probably an early 18th century bottle. Tobacco pipe stems. You always find tobacco pipes in archaeological features because they break easily and they're very, very common. There's a mark on this one that says RT for Robert Tippett. That's the maker of the pipe. That can help you date it. So these are common objects that you would find anywhere. This one is a little bit more unusual. This is actually a medicine bottle. It's Robert Turlington's Balsam of Life. It's a very famous sort of cure-all from the 18th through the early 20th century. Here's what the bottle would have actually looked like. And then here's a drawing to show you some of the wording on here. So it was patented. You can see it's got a lot of writing on it. It's a very interesting looking bottle. The one thing that's neat about this, finding this here, or it's not a surprise that you'd find it because the Turlington bottles or the Turlington balsam was marketed to the shipping industry. So it's not surprising that maybe it would show up in a ship captain's house, but maybe this was collected for some other reason. And maybe it was used by an enslaved person living in the household. Okay, so I want to move on to some more. So this is just normal sort of refuse that you would find. But there are also some other interesting things that look like personal possessions. So this is when you start thinking, this particular barrel was something that people were curating objects. So they were keeping objects. These are back For example, there's a whole medicine bottle here. So this is a complete bottle. Back in the 18th century, it wasn't a throwaway culture like today. So if you use the contents of a bottle, you would use it again. You wouldn't just throw away a perfectly good bottle that's not broken. So this was probably kept as a possession. Here's another object that wouldn't just normally get thrown away. It might have broken. It's probably deteriorated from being under the ground. It's conserved now, but this is a shoe buckle. There's a ring. Here again, you might find a ring in the backyard that somebody lost, but would you throw a ring into a barrel? I don't think so. The other thing that's interesting about this assemblage of artifacts is there's a lot. This is a stone tool, so it's a prehistoric stone tool, and it's worked. You can see it's worked on either side. It was probably used as a scraper, but there were 3 or 4 of these types of objects found in there. No flakes. So these things were something that somebody either kept because they were a tool, they could use them again, or maybe it's because they were a curiosity and they were an ancient thing.
There's a question.
Yeah.
What are the thoughts on why these items were collected?
That's a good question. It's a possibility that, like I said, we'll never know for sure. But in the case of the like an arrowhead, it might just be something that you pick something up, it's an interesting looking artifact. It might also be that there's some connection, you see some connection to the past. It might also be, in this particular case, that it's being used as a tool. Then other objects might be, they might be useful, or they might just be collected because of the way they look, like this buckle and this ring. And then I'll talk about a little bit later about some artifacts that maybe are more symbolic in the reasons why they were kept. And this one right here is actually a good example of that. This is something called a reticulated cowrie helmet. I don't know if you can see it really well in there, but this is a map that shows excuse me, a map that shows the distribution of the cowrie shells. And you can see they're mostly down, this is the United States, so they're mostly down in the Caribbean. You see those little white dots. So these aren't found really north of Florida. So this thing was brought up, this cowrie was brought up from the Caribbean, and somebody had possessed it. Now, if it was an enslaved African American, perhaps they started their life in the Caribbean, and then they were transported to New York. So this may be a reminder of that. This is an example. So these are cowrie shells also, and these are the cowrie shells that most people think of when they think of cowries. They're small. These are called Minetta cowries. They were mined off the coast of India and the Maldive Islands by the billions and traded in the transatlantic slave trade. These are all found in New York. This one was found in Albany. These little ones here were found in New York. These ones in the center are called annulus cowries, and those were also traded in Africa. And they come off of the coast of Tanzania in Africa. So, these are part of the transatlantic slave trade, just as this may be part of a connection to slavery in the Caribbean. So then we have a number of objects here that are either marked. So there's a lot of artifacts that are really not usual for a rubbish pit. So you have things that, like, for example, here's a marked USA button. So it's a Continental Army button from the Revolutionary War. You see, this is what it would actually look like. So that was collected. Other things with lettering on them. You probably can't see this too well, but it says it's got a G or a WG on it. It's a pipe bowl. And then interesting, this one. So there's other things that have been intentionally marked after the fact. So if you can see this, it says GW. It's been marked with the initials. Now, you would assume those are probably initials of someone. It's actually marked on, this is a square all, and it's marked on all four sides. So who GW was, who knows? George Washington, George Wendell. It's really hard to know, but it's personalized. It's something that's personal. This is another object which you probably can't see the mark on it, but it's got a B carved in it. So maybe this could stand for Bogart. It's a possibility. It could also be something entirely different that I'll mention later. Here's a lead musket ball, and this hole in it here you can see is not from extracting it from the muzzle. It looks like it's been punched. So that's another artifact that's been altered for some reason. And then here is here's a knife handle, and this is also very difficult to see, but there's an X that's carved in it. And so maybe this was an X that was carved to mark it as somebody's possession, but it's also possible that that X meant something much different. One of the most interesting artifacts in this collection is this piece of stoneware right here. And it's probably hard to see. You have to see it in the right light, but there's some markings on here you can see that were clearly made in the clay before this thing was made. So this was probably a crock. And you see marked pottery with designs on it, but these are very unusual. They look sort of haphazard. I'm not sure why this was originally created, but perhaps this was collected because of the marks. That's one of our questions. So perhaps somebody like Will, might have collected this, and maybe he collected it because it's got an X here, it's got a triangle, and an X inside of that. It's also got a round circle. It's got two round circles, one here with X's through them, and I'll show you a drawing that will show that better. And so it's got these kinds of marks. So here's a drawing that shows what the marks would have looked like or do look like on here. And so you have one circle that's kind of cut off, but it's got this cross on it. It's got another cross here and an X here. It's also got a mark here that could be, if you turn it upside down, it could be a GW again. So maybe that might just be coincidental. I don't know. But maybe they collected it for that reason. So this is another picture. Shows it maybe even a little bit better. It's possible that this represents what's called a dikinga, which is a cosmogram that is, you see it in Central Africa and the Congo, what is the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Angola today. But this symbol was used for many centuries, and it represents the four moments of the sun, also the crossroads between life and death. So it's really this crossroads that's important. Other examples of this is something that Dr. Chris Linder at Bard has found down in Germantown. That's another example of this. And then there was a cross that was found underneath the floorboards. So it's possible that these are symbols that have great meaning and symbolic meaning to the people who live there. The other thing that's interesting, and I mentioned the crossroads, when this barrel was found, after the analysis of exactly where it was found, it actually sits right in the center axis of this building, so right at the crossroads. So this is the north-south axis and the east-west axis. So it's possible that's what this represented. The crossroads is somewhere where you stand to make an oath. So you would make the X on the ground and stand and make an oath at that point. Some other objects in here. There's a lot of sharp objects, a lot of objects that are tools like knives, but could be also weapons and could be symbolic. So there's a lot of sharp objects. There's about 15 knives in here. This is a pistol handle knife, just like the one I showed you earlier. It's not marked. This is a meat hook. This is what it looked like before we conserved it. So you can see it's very rusty. And then this is what it looks like afterwards. And then, along with all these sharp objects, there's a whetstone at the bottom for either sharpening them, they were being used as tools, or as weapons. And this was right at the bottom. This is an axe head that was also found, and I have a picture here. This is what it looked like before we sent it in for conservation. There's a lot of metal around it. So you're looking at the top of the axe head here. So this is the top of the axe, and then it's got all this metal around it. When they did an X-ray of it, which hopefully you can see, there's pins. There's 2 pins within this. Can you see that? So this thing was at least surrounded by a couple of pins. I don't know what else was in there. The pins we were able to have conserved, and you might be able to see those in this little vial. They're very fragile, but we had them conserved, so they're available for exhibition and study. And one of the things that you sometimes see, and this is one example from Annapolis, Maryland, it's something called an inkisi, which is basically a bundle and a way to commune with the spirits of the dead. So this was something that was common in Central Africa before even the 14th century. You see these, and this particular one found in Annapolis, it's late late 18th century. It's an axe head, and when they did an X-ray of it, it was surrounded by thousands of pins and musket balls and all kinds of metal objects. So it's possible that this thing has some, or at least maybe there was an inkisi in this barrel. Whether or not it served as an inkisi, it's hard to know. Here's an example of an axe head, what it would have looked like before it deteriorated. This one was actually found underneath the floorboards. So another sharp object, another tool. This is a chisel that was also found under the floorboards of the house. So lots of sharp objects. The last set of objects I want to show you relate directly to the brutality of slavery. And this was what we found when we went to conserve these objects. These are two metal rods, and they were cataloged as metal rods. But when we had them conserved, they end up looking like this. So if you can see on there, you can see there's a hole here on one end, and then it's coming up to it would have had a larger end over here. This was a second one, and then I'll talk about the key in a minute. So that's what it looked like, and what it turns out it's actually a leg shackle. You can see this is an example that was taken from a ship that sank off the coast of Florida, the Henrietta Marie, in around the turn of the 17th century. And you can see you had a bar here, and then these would have been the leg shackles, and then there would have been a lock on the end of it. So it looked like this. This is from the 19th century. This is from a publication from the 19th century. So legs would have gone in here, and then it would have been attached here with a lock. So the other thing that we found, and this is what I don't have the object here, but you can tell looks like just a big clump of metal. But what it is, we are having this conserved. It's actually chains. So you can see the before and after with the X-ray. So there's a shackle, at least two shackles, chains, okay? And then other objects like this. This is, you can see it's just a rusty piece of metal, but then when you X-ray it, turn it around to the right way, there we go, you can see this is actually a key. If you can see this is the end of the key, and these are the teeth. So there doesn't look like there's much left of this, but they're going to try to put a composite in there and make us a copy. But people might catalog this as a nail, but when you can do X-ray like this, you can really get more information. And that's, here again, this is the importance of going back and looking at old collections and making sure that you properly take care of them, because they might yield very important information. This key right here, it might be a spigot key. That's a good possibility. I think that's what it was cataloged as. But there's also another possibility that it was part of a thumb screw. So you can see the key here. Thumbs would go in here. It's a torture device. And we found some objects that may be part of this thumb screw. So this it could be part of a lock, but it could maybe be possibly one of these thumb screws. And this is why we're also trying to get a composite made of this, so we have a better example of what this might have been. Then the other thing that I just have some other X-rays, and this is what's really interesting with the X-rays, because you can actually get an idea of what you have there, even if there's nothing left. Like the key, the key I showed. This right here looks like it's probably part of a spoon. There's really nothing left of it, but at least we know that there was a spoon. This is probably part of a knife. Anytime you see a solid area like this, that means there's a lot of the parent material left and you can probably conserve it. If it's more like this, then there's probably nothing left of it. But you still have a record of it. Some other objects. This is something we're not sure what it is, but it's going through conservation, so we'll see. And then other interesting objects that were, this might be the end of. This could be the end of another shackle. We're not sure, but it looks like there's enough there to conserve. And then we also have we have some spikes, things like that. So this is an ongoing project, and there again, I want to reemphasize the idea that it's important to reevaluate not just the artifacts but the history, because there's always new information to find out. There's always a different way of rearticulating the historical the story of the past, and which is what we're trying to do here. So as we think about today's Juneteenth and we remember and commemorate the end of enslavement for those people in Texas in 1865, we have to remember that New York State was also part of that structural history of inequality and racism, and it's important that we recognize that. So if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. You can find me on the New York State Museum website. Under Mike Lucas, just look for historical archaeology and you'll find me. And everybody stay well and be safe.